I came home early on a Tuesday afternoon and found my daughter crying on my front porch, while her in-laws sat inside my living room going through paperwork about my house. For a second, I honestly thought I was seeing things. It was one of those warm April afternoons in Springfield, Missouri. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just another workday. I'd left my bookkeeping office around 2 o'clock after a longtime client canceled a meeting. Since I unexpectedly had the afternoon free, I stopped by Walmart on South Campbell Avenue to pick up groceries. I remember buying coffee paper towels and a rotisserie chicken. Normal things. Ordinary things. The kind of errands you forget about 5 minutes later. I pulled into my driveway at exactly 2:17 p.m. The clock on my Honda CR-V said so. That's when I saw Emily. My daughter was sitting on the front porch swing. She wasn't scrolling on her phone. She wasn't reading. She was crying. Not quietly either. Her shoulders were shaking. At 32 years old, Emily wasn't someone who cried easily. Even as a child, she tended to keep things bottled up. Seeing her like that immediately made my stomach tighten. I shut off the engine and got out. "Emily." She looked up quickly and wiped her eyes. Too quickly. The way people do when they've been caught. "Mom." "What happened?" She stood up. "Nothing." I almost laughed. "Nothing." The girl looked like she'd spent an hour crying. I dropped the grocery bags on the porch. "Emily." She stared down at her shoes. That was when I noticed something else. She wasn't upset because of something that happened outside. She was upset because of something inside. I followed her gaze toward the house. The front door was partially open. I could hear voices. My living room. My house. "What is going on?" Emily hesitated. Then she said something that made absolutely no sense. "I didn't want them here." Them. I didn't ask who. Somehow I already knew. Ryan's parents. Frank and Denise Coleman. I walked straight into the house. The second I stepped into the living room, I froze. Papers covered my coffee table. Papers covered my dining table. There were folders open. Documents spread out. Property records. Insurance statements. Tax documents. Home valuation estimates. And sitting right in the middle of all of it were Frank and Denise. Like they owned the place. Frank looked up first. "Oh, Linda, you're home early." I stood there staring at him. For a moment, I couldn't even process what I was seeing. Denise smiled. Not embarrassed. Not apologetic. Just comfortable. We were helping Emily think about the future. I set my purse down very slowly. The future of what? Denise glanced at the paperwork. The family. I looked at the papers again. Then back at her. My family. She laughed lightly. You know the kind of laugh people use when they're trying to sound friendly while saying something completely inappropriate. Well, eventually these things affect everyone. I felt my jaw tighten. The house around us wasn't some investment property. My husband Tom and I had spent 25 years paying for it. We bought it when Emily was 7 years old. We painted every room ourselves. Tom built the back deck. He planted the maple tree in the yard. Every inch of that house contained memories, and these people were sitting there sorting through documents like they were planning an estate sale. Frank tapped a stack of papers. "We're just looking ahead." Looking ahead to what? He exchanged a glance with Denise. Then Denise spoke. "Well, eventually Emily and Ryan will need a larger place." I folded my arms. "So buy one." The room went silent. Frank cleared his throat. "That's not what she means." "Oh, I know exactly what she means." For the first time, Denise's smile slipped, only slightly, but I saw it. The conversation had finally become uncomfortable. Good, because I was getting tired of being the only uncomfortable person in the room. Emily quietly stepped inside from the porch. Her eyes were red. She looked exhausted. I turned toward her. "Emily." She hesitated. Then the words started coming. Apparently this had been building for months. Little comments at family dinners. Suggestions. Questions. Frank and Denise repeatedly bringing up my house. Talking about how big it was. Talking about how expensive housing had become. Talking about how families should help each other. At first, Emily thought they were just making conversation. Then the conversations became more specific. Would I ever downsize? Would I consider moving into a retirement community? Did I really need all that space? Eventually, they began asking Ryan to talk to Emily, then asking Emily to talk to me. The pressure never stopped. I looked at Ryan's parents. Neither one denied it. That told me everything. I took a deep breath. I wanted to yell. I wanted to throw every one of those papers into a trash bag. But anger rarely helps, especially with people who enjoy creating drama. So I stayed calm. "Put everything back." Frank frowned. "Linda." Now. The room became very quiet. Denise started gathering papers. Frank looked irritated. Good. Let him be irritated. They spent the next several minutes shoving documents into folders. Not one apology. Not one acknowledgement that they'd crossed a line. When they finally reached the front door, Denise paused. She turned back toward me. The expression on her face bothered me more than anything else that afternoon, because she wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't defeated. She looked confident, almost amused. This conversation isn't over. I stared at her. Actually, it is. She smiled, a small smile. Then she walked out. Frank followed her to their SUV. A few seconds later, they drove away. The house became quiet again. Emily sank onto the couch. I sat beside her. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Outside, I could hear a lawnmower somewhere down the street. A dog barking. Ordinary neighborhood sounds. But something no longer felt ordinary. Because deep down, I had the uncomfortable feeling that what happened that afternoon wasn't the problem. It was the beginning of one. And I had no idea how far those people were willing to go. For about a week after that afternoon, I convinced myself maybe things would calm down. Maybe Frank and Denise had finally gotten the message. Maybe being told to leave my house had embarrassed them enough to make them back off. I should have known better. The first phone call came 3 days later. It was a Thursday evening. I was sitting at my kitchen table paying bills, listening to an old Eagles album on a small Bluetooth speaker. My phone rang. Denise. I stared at the screen. For a moment I considered ignoring it. Instead I answered, "Hello." Her voice sounded cheerful. Almost too cheerful. "Linda, I was just thinking about you." That sentence alone made me nervous. People rarely call to tell you they're thinking about you. Usually they want something. "I'm fine," I said. Good, good. Listen, I wanted to apologize if things felt awkward the other day." I waited. There it was. The word if. Not an apology. A loophole. If things felt awkward. Denise continued. "We were only trying to help." I leaned back in my chair. "Help who?" There was a brief silence. Then she laughed. "You know what I mean." "No, actually, I don't." Another pause. Then she changed the subject. "Have you ever thought about downsizing?" I closed my eyes. There it was again. Not even a week later. The same conversation. The same agenda. The same house. I ended the call less than a minute later. Unfortunately, that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the pressure started coming from every direction. Phone calls. Texts. Comments. Little remarks disguised as concern. One Saturday afternoon, Emily and Ryan invited me to lunch at Applebee's. At first, everything seemed normal. We ordered burgers. Talked about work. Talked about the Cardinals. Then Ryan cleared his throat. I knew that look. I'd seen it on his face before. The look people get when they're about to say something they know you won't like. "Linda," he said carefully. "Yeah. You ever think about retirement communities?" I set down my iced tea. Slowly. "Ryan." He shifted uncomfortably. "What? Did your parents put you up to this?" His silence answered the question. Across the table, Emily looked like she wanted to disappear. The conversation died right there. Nobody enjoyed the rest of lunch. Least of all Ryan. A few days later, I got another surprise. My friend Sharon called. Sharon and I had attended the same church for almost 15 years. "Linda." "Hey. You okay?" The question caught me off guard. "Sure." There was a pause. Then Sharon said something strange. "I just wanted to make sure." "Make sure of what?" Another pause. "People have been talking." That got my attention. Apparently, Denise had been making comments around church. Nothing direct. Nothing obvious. Just little observations. "Linda lives alone now. That house is probably too much for her. She's getting older. Wouldn't it be nice if family could help?" The kind of comments that sound innocent until you realize they're not. I thanked Sharon for letting me know. Then I sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes afterward. Not angry. Disappointed. There was something sad about watching grown adults try to manipulate people through gossip. Especially people pushing 60. A week later, things somehow got even stranger. And honestly, if I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't have believed it. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was at my office reviewing client accounts when my phone buzzed. A text message. From Denise. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Then I read it. "If we get that house, we'll finally have room for the RV." I blinked. Read it again. Then laughed out loud. Not because it was funny. Because it was ridiculous. A few seconds later, another text arrived. "OMG, wrong person. Too late. Way too late." I had already taken screenshots. Several screenshots, then emailed them to myself, then printed copies. Old bookkeeping habits die hard. I believe in records, especially when people accidentally tell the truth. That evening, Emily came over. She looked exhausted, more exhausted than I'd ever seen her. I made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. For several minutes, she simply stared into her mug. Finally, she spoke. "They won't stop." I knew exactly who she meant. "What happened?" Emily rubbed her forehead. "They bring it up constantly." She explained how every family gathering somehow led back to my house. Every conversation, every visit, every dinner. Frank would mention real estate prices. Denise would talk about inheritance. Ryan would get quiet. Then arguments would start on the drive home. I felt terrible for her, because none of this was really about her. She had become the rope in a tug of war. One side pulling, the other side resisting, and she was getting burned in the middle. "What does Ryan say?" I asked. Emily sighed. "He keeps saying they're trying to help." I shook my head. "No, they're trying to benefit." That wasn't the same thing. Not even close. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. Completely by accident. I was meeting a client at a local coffee shop downtown. As I walked in, I spotted Frank sitting with a realtor. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then I heard my address. I froze. Not visibly, just enough to listen. The realtor was discussing renovation estimates, kitchen updates, bathroom upgrades, property value projections. My property. My house. The one Frank didn't own. The one nobody had offered to sell. I slipped out before they noticed me. Then sat in my car staring through the windshield. The audacity was almost impressive. These people were planning improvements to a home that wasn't theirs. The situation had crossed far beyond entitlement. It was obsession. That night I barely slept. Not because I was worried about losing the house. Legally, I wasn't. The property was fully paid off. The title was secure. The law was on my side. But something else bothered me. Why were they so determined? What was driving this? People don't usually behave this way unless something bigger is going on. The answer came sooner than expected. 3 nights later, Emily arrived at my house after 9 o'clock. I opened the door and immediately knew something had happened. She looked pale, tense, worn down. We sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where so many difficult conversations seemed to happen. Then she told me something that changed everything. Frank had started asking detailed questions about my finances. Not just the house. Everything. My retirement accounts, my savings, my investments, even my life insurance. I felt a chill move through me. Normal people don't ask those questions. Not repeatedly. Not obsessively. Not unless they're counting money that doesn't belong to them. Emily looked at me. "What do we do?" I didn't answer right away. Because for the first time I wasn't simply dealing with rude in-laws. Something else was happening. Something bigger. And I had a feeling that if I wanted the truth, I was going to have to start digging for it myself. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what Emily had told me. Why would Frank care about my retirement account? Why would Denise want to know the balance of my savings? Why were they asking questions about life insurance? None of it made sense, at least not on the surface. One thing I'd learned after 20 years running a bookkeeping business was that numbers usually tell the truth long before people do. And when somebody becomes obsessed with another person's finances, there's usually a reason. I just hadn't found it yet. The following Monday, I was having lunch with Sharon after church committee planning. We were sitting at a small cafe near Battlefield Road. Nothing fancy. Just sandwiches and iced tea. The conversation drifted from church events to local news and eventually landed on Frank Coleman. Sharon lowered her voice. "You know his business isn't doing very well, right?" I nearly dropped my fork. "What?" She looked surprised. "You didn't know?" Apparently I didn't. Frank owned a small construction company. At least he used to. Over the years, I'd heard him brag about jobs, crews, equipment, and contracts. According to Frank, business was always booming. But Sharon's husband worked in commercial construction, and the story he was hearing was very different. Several projects had fallen through. Employees had left. Suppliers were demanding payment. The company wasn't growing. It was struggling. Suddenly, a lot of things started clicking into place. Not enough to form a complete picture, but enough to make me curious. Very curious. That evening, I sat at my dining room table with my laptop. I wasn't looking for dirt. I was looking for answers. Public records are amazing things. People often forget how much information is available if you know where to look. Property records, court filings, business registrations, tax lines. The more I searched, the more uncomfortable I became. Frank's company had multiple financial issues. Nothing criminal. Nothing dramatic. Just one problem after another. Late payments, debt disputes, loans. A pattern of financial pressure stretching back years. I leaned back in my chair. Now the obsession with my house was starting to make sense. The next surprise arrived 2 days later, and it came from the most unexpected source imaginable. The neighborhood barber. His name was Carl. Carl knew everybody. More importantly, Carl knew everybody's business. I stopped in for a haircut Wednesday afternoon. Halfway through trimming my hair, Carl casually mentioned seeing Frank at a local RV dealership. Apparently not for shopping, for arguing. The RV Frank and Denise owned was behind on payments, several months behind. Carl didn't know exact numbers, but he knew enough. By the time I walked out of that barber shop, my understanding of the situation had completely changed. This wasn't about family. This wasn't about helping Emily. This wasn't about future planning. This was about money. Their money, or more specifically, the lack of it. Still, I wasn't prepared for what came next. Friday evening, Emily showed up unexpectedly. Again. I hated seeing her arrive looking defeated. Lately, it seemed to happen every week. She sat down at my kitchen island. I poured coffee. Neither of us touched it. Finally, she spoke. "Ryan told me something." Her voice sounded hollow. The kind of voice people use when they're still trying to process bad news. "What happened?" She stared at the countertop. Then she said 3 words that changed everything. "He signed loans." I frowned. "What kind of loans?" "His parents' loans." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the background. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Emily finally continued. Over the years, Ryan had co-signed multiple loans for Frank and Denise. Not one. Several. Personal loans. Vehicle loans. Business-related debt. Thousands and thousands of dollars. Emily had no idea. Not until recently. And now she was discovering just how much financial risk Ryan had taken on. Risk he never discussed with her. Risk his parents had encouraged. I could see the hurt in her face, the betrayal, not just from Frank and Denise, from her husband. "He says he was trying to help them." I nodded slowly. "I believe him." She looked surprised. "You do?" "I believe he thought he was helping. That didn't make it right." But Ryan wasn't the mastermind here. Ryan had spent years being manipulated by people who knew exactly how to push his buttons. Guilt, obligation, family loyalty. The tools worked because he'd been using them his entire life. Unfortunately, now he was starting to realize it. And he didn't like what he saw. A few weeks later, the entire family gathered for a Memorial Day barbecue. Frank and Denise hosted. Nearly 20 relatives showed up. Kids ran through the yard. People stood around the grill. Country music played from outdoor speakers. The weather was beautiful. The atmosphere wasn't. Not for me. About an hour into the gathering, Frank made a mistake. A big one. Standing near the grill, he started talking about home improvement projects, then renovations, then future plans. Eventually, he started describing upgrades he'd make to a certain property. My property. My house. As if ownership had already been settled. Several relatives exchanged awkward glances. I simply sipped my iced tea. Frank kept talking. The funny thing was he had no idea what I already knew. He didn't know I knew about the debt. He didn't know I knew about the loans. He didn't know I knew the RV was practically one missed payment away from disappearing. And somehow that made the whole performance almost funny. Almost. The real turning point happened 3 weeks later. It was a Thursday morning. I was reviewing payroll reports when my phone rang. Unknown number. Normally I let those go to voicemail. For some reason I answered. Nobody spoke. Just background noise. Then the call disconnected. Strange. An hour later a voicemail notification appeared. I opened it. And everything changed. Apparently, someone had accidentally forwarded a message to the wrong number. My number. The recording wasn't long. Maybe 20 seconds. But 20 seconds was enough. Denise's voice came through clearly. "If we can get Linda's house into Ryan's name, our problems are over." Then the message ended. That was it. No confusion. No misunderstanding. No alternate interpretation. Just a plain statement. Simple. Direct. Honest. For several minutes I sat frozen at my desk, listening again, and again, and again. The recording confirmed everything I'd suspected. They weren't interested in family. They weren't concerned about Emily's future. They weren't trying to help. My house had become their solution, their rescue plan, their escape route. I forwarded the voicemail to my personal email, then saved copies in 3 separate locations. Bookkeepers don't trust a single backup. As I sat there staring at my computer screen, I realized something important. For months I'd been reacting, defending, responding, trying to keep the peace. That phase was over. Because now I had proof. Not assumptions. Not rumors. Proof. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I wasn't worried about what Frank and Denise might do next. I was wondering what I was going to do. After I listened to that voicemail for the 10th time, I shut my office door and just sat there. Not because I was shocked anymore. At that point, very little about Frank and Denise surprised me. What bothered me was how long they'd been working toward this. Months. Maybe years. The house wasn't some sudden idea. It was a plan. A slow-moving plan. And if I was honest, that realization hurt more than the voicemail itself. Because Emily had married into that family. And no matter what happened next, she would be caught in the middle. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about. I wasn't worried about Frank. I wasn't worried about Denise. I was worried about my daughter. That weekend I called an attorney. His name was Robert Jenkins. A friend from church had recommended him years earlier. We met Monday morning. I brought everything. The screenshots. The text messages. The voicemail. Notes I'd been keeping. Robert spent nearly an hour reviewing everything. Finally, he looked up. "Linda, legally you're in good shape." I nodded. "Good. Your property is protected." That's what I thought. He leaned back. But protection and peace are two different things. That sentence stayed with me. Because he was right. The law could protect my house. The law couldn't stop family drama, unfortunately. Robert recommended a few additional steps. Nothing extreme. Just smart precautions. Updated estate documents. Additional legal protections. Clear written instructions regarding future ownership. I agreed. Not because I expected someone to break into my house and steal it, but because I was tired of uncertainty. For the first time in months, I wanted things settled. Completely. A few days later, I met with my financial advisor. Then my insurance agent. Then my banker. One appointment after another. Every conversation moved me a little closer to peace of mind. Meanwhile, Frank and Denise seemed more confident than ever, which was interesting. People tend to become overconfident when they think they're winning. The phone calls continued. The comments continued. The pressure continued. But something had changed. I no longer felt defensive. Now I understood exactly what I was dealing with. And knowledge changes everything. Around that same time, Emily moved into my guest room. Temporarily. At least that was the plan. One Friday evening, she arrived with 2 suitcases and a tired smile. I helped carry her things inside. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. The situation spoke for itself. Ryan hadn't cheated. There wasn't some huge dramatic betrayal. The problem was years of manipulation finally catching up with their marriage. Emily was exhausted. Ryan was overwhelmed. Neither of them knew how to move forward. That first week was difficult. Some nights, Emily sat at the kitchen table long after midnight. Sometimes talking. Sometimes staring out the window. Sometimes crying quietly. I hated seeing her like that. And more than once I wondered whether I should simply let everything go. Maybe I should stop fighting. Maybe I should ignore Frank and Denise. Maybe I should take the easy road. But every time I considered it, I remembered that voicemail. If we can get Linda's house into Ryan's name, our problems are over. Number. People like that don't stop because you give in. They stop when they can't continue. One evening, Ryan showed up unexpectedly. I almost didn't answer the door. Almost. When I opened it, he looked terrible. The poor guy hadn't slept. His eyes were red. His shoulders slumped. For a moment, I felt sorry for him. Then again, I always had. Ryan wasn't a bad person. Weak sometimes. Misguided sometimes, but not bad. "Can we talk?" he asked. We sat on the back deck. The same deck Tom built years ago. The same deck where we'd celebrated birthdays, graduations, and family cookouts. Ryan stared into the backyard. Then he said something I never expected. "You were right." I didn't respond. I wanted him to continue. "They've been doing this my whole life." The words came slowly, like he was admitting them to himself for the first time. The guilt, the pressure, the expectations, the constant reminders about what he owed them, what he should do for them, what sacrifices family makes. The realization was crushing him. And honestly, I understood why. Nobody wants to discover they've been manipulated by their own parents. Especially not at 34 years old. Ryan spent nearly 2 hours talking. By the end of the conversation, he looked lighter. Not happy, but clearer. Like someone finally seeing a situation for what it really is. Before he left, he said something important. "They're planning something." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" Ryan hesitated, then sighed. "They think they're close." I almost laughed. Of course they did. They've been talking about a family gathering. A gathering, he nodded. A big one. Apparently Frank and Denise were organizing a large summer family reunion. Aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone. More than 30 relatives. At first that sounded harmless. Then Ryan explained the real reason. They planned to bring up inheritance. Publicly. In front of everyone. The goal was obvious. Corner me. Pressure me. Make me look unreasonable if I refused. The more Ryan talked, the more unbelievable it sounded. Yet somehow it fit perfectly. Frank loved an audience. Denise loved social pressure. A family gathering would give them both. A few days later, invitations started appearing on Facebook. Then text messages, then phone calls. Everybody was invited. The reunion would be held at a large community event space outside Springfield. 3 weeks away. As the date approached, I quietly continued preparing. Documents organized. Evidence secured. Legal protections completed. I wasn't building a revenge plan. Not exactly. I was preparing for the truth. And sometimes truth feels a lot like revenge when dishonest people are exposed. The night before the reunion, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid. Because I knew what was coming. The next afternoon, Emily and I arrived together. Cars filled the parking lot. People were already gathering outside. Children ran across the grass. Relatives carried casseroles into the building. Normal family reunion stuff, at least on the surface. Inside tables stretched across the room. More than 30 family members were already there. Laughing, talking, eating. Completely unaware of the storm heading their way. Across the room I spotted Frank, standing proudly near the buffet. Denise beside him. Both smiling. Both confident. Both absolutely convinced they were about to win. And for the first time since this entire mess began, I felt completely calm. Because they had no idea what was about to happen. By the time Emily and I walked into the reunion hall, nearly every table was full. The event was being held at a community center just outside Springfield, the kind of place people rented for weddings, anniversaries, and retirement parties. The smell of barbecue drifted through the room. Kids chased each other between tables. Someone had brought homemade peach cobbler. On the surface, it looked like a perfectly normal family gathering. But I could feel something else underneath it. Expectation. Frank and Denise were expecting something. And judging by the confidence on their faces, they thought they had this whole situation under control. I smiled to myself. That wouldn't last. Emily and I took seats near the middle of the room. A few relatives came over to chat. Others asked how work was going. Normal conversations? Meanwhile, Frank kept glancing in my direction. Waiting. Watching. Like a fisherman staring at a line. Around 6 o'clock, everyone settled in for dinner. Frank stood and tapped a glass. The room gradually quieted. Before we eat, he announced, "I'd like to say a few words." Of course he would. Several relatives nodded politely. Frank launched into a speech about family, support, togetherness, looking after future generations. I noticed Denise smiling proudly beside him. Then came the part I'd been expecting. "One thing I've always believed," Frank continued, "is that families should think ahead. We should make sure important things stay within the family." There it was, the setup. Several people exchanged confused glances. Others simply kept eating. Frank wasn't finished. He looked directly at me. "Linda, you've built a wonderful life, a beautiful home. Have you thought much about what happens to it someday?" The room became noticeably quieter. Even people who didn't know the backstory could sense something awkward was happening. I set down my fork. Slowly. Carefully. Across from me, Emily looked nervous. Ryan sat 2 tables away. His expression was unreadable. Frank continued. "I'm only asking because these are conversations families should have." Denise nodded. "Exactly." I looked around the room. 30-some relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, in-laws, friends, every single person Frank and Denise hoped would pressure me. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Then I remembered my daughter crying on my porch. I remembered the months of manipulation, the lies, the pressure, the voicemail, number, not sorry. Not even a little. I stood up. The room fell completely silent. Frank smiled. He thought I'd taken the bait. He thought I was about to defend myself. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder. The smile disappeared almost immediately. "You're right, Frank," I said. "Families should have honest conversations." The room stayed silent. You could practically hear people breathing. I opened the folder. "Since we're discussing my property, I think everyone deserves the full story." Frank shifted in his chair. For the first time all evening, he looked uncomfortable. "Good. I began with the text message, the one Denise accidentally sent. I read it aloud, word for word. "If we get that house, we'll finally have room for the RV." A few relatives laughed, others looked surprised. Denise's face immediately turned red. That was taken out of context. I nodded. "Maybe." Then I pulled out another page. "Let's add more context." Next came documentation showing repeated requests about my finances. Questions about savings, investments, retirement accounts, life insurance. The room grew quieter. Several relatives looked at Frank, then at Denise, then back at me. But I still wasn't finished. Not even close. I took out my phone and pressed play. The voicemail echoed through the room. Denise's voice was unmistakable. "If we can get Linda's house into Ryan's name, our problems are over." Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The recording ended. For a few seconds, the entire room seemed frozen. Then someone whispered, "Wow." Another relative shook his head. An aunt sitting near the front looked genuinely horrified. Denise stared at the floor. Frank looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. But the biggest surprise came next. Ryan stood up. Nobody had expected that, including me. He looked at his parents, then at the rest of the family, and finally at Emily. "I need to say something." The room remained silent. Ryan took a deep breath. "My mother and father have been pressuring us for years." Frank immediately interrupted. "Ryan, no." For the first time since I'd known him, Ryan didn't back down. "No, Dad." The room got even quieter. Ryan explained the loans, the financial pressure, the guilt, the expectations, the constant demands for help. Every uncomfortable truth came pouring out. Years of frustration, years of manipulation, years of silence, all at once. Several relatives looked stunned. Others looked angry. One uncle actually stood up and walked outside. Apparently he'd heard enough. Then Emily spoke, and honestly her words hit hardest. Because they weren't angry. They were sad. She talked about feeling trapped, about trying to keep peace between her husband and her mother, about being pressured from every direction, about the afternoon she'd sat crying on my porch. By the time she finished, several people had tears in their eyes, including me. Frank looked around the room, desperately, searching for support. He didn't find much. Because once people heard the whole story, there wasn't much left to defend. The image Frank and Denise had carefully built over the years started collapsing right in front of them. Not because I attacked them, because their own actions finally caught up with them. Then came the final piece, the one nobody expected, including Frank and Denise. I pulled out one last document. I should probably mention something else. The room listened. My estate plan was updated several weeks ago. Frank's expression tightened. I continued. "The house has been placed in a protected family trust." A few people nodded. Others looked confused. The attorney in the room smiled immediately. He understood. Frank did too. Eventually. "What does that mean?" he asked. I smiled politely. "It means nobody can pressure me into giving the house away." Silence. "It means nobody can manipulate Emily through future ownership." More silence. "And it means this conversation is officially over." That was it. No shouting. No dramatic threats. No grand revenge speech. Just facts. Simple fact. And somehow that was more devastating than any argument could have been. Within 20 minutes, people began leaving. Conversations broke into smaller groups. Frank and Denise stayed mostly by themselves. Few people approached them. Even fewer defended them. Their reputation hadn't been destroyed by me. They had destroyed it themselves. I simply opened the curtain. Over the next few months, life gradually settled down. Ryan cut financial ties with his parents. Not completely, but enough. He and Emily started marriage counseling. Slowly they began rebuilding trust. It wasn't easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. As for Frank and Denise, they stopped calling. Stopped texting. Stopped asking about the house. Funny how quickly boundaries become clear when people realize they aren't negotiable. One evening that fall, I sat on the back deck watching the sunset. The same deck Tom built all those years ago. The maple tree in the yard had started turning red. A cool breeze moved through the leaves. And for the first time in a long while, everything felt peaceful. I thought about everything that had happened. The pressure, the conflict, the temptation to stay silent, the temptation to simply give in. I'm glad I didn't, because I learned something important. Kindness and weakness aren't the same thing. You can be generous without surrendering your boundaries. You can love your family without allowing them to take advantage of you. And sometimes the most satisfying form of revenge isn't hurting someone. It's calmly refusing to let them control your life. If you've ever had to stand your ground when family pushed too far, you're not alone. Sometimes the hardest boundaries are the ones we set with people we love. Thank you for spending this time with me, and if this story meant something to you, I'd love for you to join me again for the next one.